Hello and welcome everybody in joining us to talk about checks this morning. Before we kick off, I just want to give a big thanks to Payments Canada for having us again this year at the Payments Canada Summit. It's been 19 consecutive years, and we're happy to join today. We're happy to be here today. And thanks to all of you for joining us in this session. My name is Abdulah Tarazi. I lead business development and strategy at Expertus. Now an IBM company and part of the IBM Payment Center. So today we're here to talk about checks, about their place in the payments industry. We're going to cover some of the trends, their use, some things around security, and their place in the payments modernization. And today, I'm joined by an incredible panel, and I'll get to them in a second. We'll be able to introduce every single one of them. Before I do, I'm going to simply pop up a poll. If you can take a look and answer. The idea here is just to understand your view on the on checks. Do you think checks still have a place in today's payments industry? Now, checks, a first form of check, made its appearance back in the 1500s. So that's a 500-year-old technology that we're going to be talking about today. And here with me, I have my colleagues, Jude, Andrew, and Greg. And I'll let them introduce themselves. Gentlemen, I'm going to throw it to you. If you can just, introduce yourself, a little bit about your expertise in payments and payments and checks. And if you could answer in one sentence that same question, do you think, in your opinion, do checks still have their place in today's payments industry? Jude, let's start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Abdullah. Greg Ausman. I'm a partner within IBM's Payment Center and been focused on banking and financial services for about 20 years now. And I got heavily involved in check during the electronic exchange programs going on in a number of banks 5 or 6 years ago. So I've been tied at the hip to the evolution of check over the last few years. Do checks play a role? Absolutely. It's no surprise that checks are declining. Eventually, they will go away. But I always like to, remind people that if we think about, let's say, the dollar value of credit card payments, which is about $500 billion a year in Canada, and you ask them, what do you think check payments are? Usually, they'll come and they'll say, 100 billion, 50 billion. Check payments are about 3 trillion, about 6 times the payments of credit cards. So even though the numbers are declining about 6% per year, and we had a pretty big drop off during COVID, the reality is checks are still a hugely important part of the payments ecosystem in Canada.
Jude, how about you? Can you introduce yourself and give us a little bit of your view on the reality of checks in this industry?
Sure. I provide currently advisory and board and client board type services to the industry, the financial services industry. But I've spent 30 years plus in retail banking and insurance, and about 15 years of those deeply in the payments areas, covering cards, cash, and check as a big part of it. So my observations are, what has been the history of checks since back in TECP days through to remote deposit capture, Caribbean, Canada, up against the US, and what's happening now up against the payments modernization agenda.
And Andrew, to you?
And my answer, the answer to the question is similar to Greg. Checks provide, with the 500-year history, they provide some value today, and they do have a place until they're replaced. And a lot of the agenda of this conference is about what is the successful strategy of moving away from them and replaced with what, for what constituents. And I think that'll be a good book of today's conversation.
I'll go next, Abdulah. Hey, I'm Andrew Higgins. I lead the IBM Payment Center globally. Been working in the payment space since I actually joined IBM during the TCP days. So I think all of us have a little bit of gun shyness to that, right? And I've been working in moving from check now for at least 10 years. And I'm going to answer the question by saying, first, I don't write any checks. Second, I don't think that's indicative of the rest of the world, or at least North America, because people write checks still and businesses write checks. So to say that they're obsolete, don't think that's the case. To say that other countries have moved away, sure, you can mandate moving away. You can cut off the service, but that doesn't mean you've made checks obsolete. So, there's a lot of answers to this question on how you move away from check, but you can choose a couple of choices. You can either move away, you can mandate that moving away, you can disincentivize using checks, or you can fundamentally create a better check. And that's really, I guess, where a lot of this conversation will go. So,
absolutely, we're going to try to cover some of those aspects and some of those options today. But back to what Greg was stating earlier, some of the stats. Volume decreasing annually, rate of about 9%. Value-wise, very stagnant. In fact, an average check is over $6,000 here in Canada. In comparison, the second payment type is EFT at around $1,700. So there is still a wide use of it, and it's actually a lot of value with checks. So why with the availability of wires, EFTs, and now real-time rail in the coming year, and all the different options that are available, why do Canadians still use checks? Mostly, probably corporates and government are still using checks. So why is that?
Maybe I'll just jump in with some observations. The conference agenda really talks about a lot of the weaknesses and the needed acceleration of movement away from checks and cash. The cost pressures, the lack of reconciliation and traceability that comes with check, the inability to embed with digital experiences, speed, irrevocability, et cetera, et cetera. But I think to answer the question that you're asking is, what are the strengths of check? So why do people still use them? And I was thinking about this for a bit. Number one, with that history, there's such a ubiquity, scale, and degree of standardization to check that it's the easiest go-to piece for a large portion of the population until that scale, ubiquity, and standardization is reached through other payments. There's a trust and a confidence with that level of history that will keep corporates and governments using them. That it will accelerate away from them, as we've seen in the pandemic, of course, with greater trust of disbursements, for example, through governments' direct deposit. And then there's a sense of control built into corporates and governments around treasury and float management, the flexibility, managing of recurring payments and forward dating payments that is not yet apparent in every other form of payment that's out there. So those are some of the strengths of checks, I think, that keep people using them. Cost has not hit the consumer or the businesses yet. So nobody has incented businesses and consumers to move away from checks. It's built into their banking fees today. So that hasn't been a push either. So for all of those reasons, it's going to remain sticky. I think those are four of the fundamental things that have to be replaced through other forms of payments in the payments in the coming years.
But again, you're talking about the trust behind it, and I'm looking, and you mentioned it. When we're talking about other payment types, there is speed, the digital aspect, the experience is a whole lot easier. I mean, I like just ordering a checkbook is a whole lot of it's a very lengthy process. So that's why when I'm looking at this, I'm looking at all these corporates that are generating checks at a huge rate. Volumes. Why is it? I still have questions. I'm not really sure I get it. Why are they still using checks?
Yeah, and let me jump in on that one, Abdulah. I think if we think about who's writing checks, it's less about the individuals writing checks to individuals, except for maybe very large dollar figures. For businesses, and my brother has a sort of small, medium-sized business, and he does a lot of cross-border trade, for example. The ability to write a check, especially to a supplier you don't deal with on a regular basis, is probably the simplest, cheapest way to pay a supplier compared to setting up any of the alternatives. And I would say that really for businesses, it's going to come down to mostly convenience and ease of use. And it's our challenge as an industry to create something that's better than check, because it's essentially free for businesses. To Jude's point, it's buried in their banking fees. They're not paying for a check. So if I need to pay somebody $10,000 on a one-off basis, why would I spend any effort? It's free and it's easy. I can write a check, drop it in the mail. You just can't beat the convenience.
Yeah, I'm going to add one point. It's not about the rail. It's not about the type. It's about what's written around it. Now, cheques is the most flexibility whatsoever. As a business, I can use a check to pretty much pay whatever type of supplier I have out there. I can't do that with other payment types without additional overlay services built around them that are more custom to that particular industry or that particular type of business and exchange. What we're missing is that particular interaction, that experience that hasn't been built around every other payment type. And frankly, that just makes check easier to use.
So I get okay, so I hear you. And it's really, we're talking about the initial investment into setting up a system that can do, other payment types, whereas checks is rather easy. And I get this, but even if we're looking at security, for example, and security surrounding checks and fraud surrounding checks, if we look at the stats from the AFB in 2020, they've looked at the different financial professionals, and all of them who declared that they had a fraud or they realized they saw fraud activity, 66% of them said that was associated with checks, with the check payment type, versus AFTs and all and wires. I think it was around 20% or low. So it is not like, I understand that it's cheap, but it's you want to make sure that your payment is secure. So can you talk to us, maybe Jude, can you talk to us a little bit about security and fraud and how that's involved in that check in the check operations?
Sure. I think your stats. First of all, the one of the weaknesses of checks, which is the time to clear and the time before you're guaranteed good funds, actually has allowed for an inefficient way to address pure check fraud. So in those 3 days of recourse, over the years, systems have been set up to address a good chunk of check fraud, and consumers feeling the impact and businesses feeling the impact of check fraud aren't nearly as is not nearly as big as banks feeling the impact and the growing impact. So check fraud, as it grows, again, it's becoming a pain. It has been a pain, a growing pain for the financial institutions, more so than the businesses and the consumers actually writing the checks, because they're sheltered from that somewhat. The second thing about fraud and investments around fraud is, there's an ever increasing pool of funds just required to keep those fraud algorithms around checks well understood. But criminals are increasingly using a variety of payments. So, whether if you're money laundering or committing a financial crime, you're going to take advantage of asymmetries between the way checks clear, cross-border checks clear. How do you actually route payments, then subsequent payments and deposits into deposit accounts? Cleanse them that way, place them through after they've been placed, and then use credit vehicles to get them out. So between wires and checks, EFT, credit and debit cards, and balancing between accounts, there's a lot of asymmetries in the way all of those payment mechanisms are handled that I think are ripe for exploitation. So that's a new area of investment for fraud, which means the more complex you make your payment ecosystem with different solutions, that's a lot of money to go and spend to have to try to tie it all together increasingly in a big way. So it will continue to become a big pain, but it's still more incentive for banks to want to get off of check and simplify their payments universe and unify their fraud approaches before consumers and businesses declare, hey, I'm out. Because for some reason, there's still a degree of trust over checks.
And banks are willing to invest. I mean, check operation is still a big portion of checks, and it's not something they're going to look at this and say, well, the fraud is too high, so I'm having it right there. So talk to us, maybe Greg and Andrew, can you describe a little bit of the check operations? What does that look like for the bank?
Sure.
Fees, where are they getting it? How are they covering their costs for checks?
Sure. And maybe I'll touch on kind of the various steps that go into the check process and break it down a little bit. So when we think about the capture piece, the electronic capture, I mean, that was a huge convenience for the customer. And that's part of the reason for the continued, I'll say popularity of check, but it was also a huge cost savings for financial institutions because the cost of paper capture is huge. But over 85% of checks now are basically captured at the point of deposit. So there's no sort of back office, or there still is, and banks frankly still have too much infrastructure devoted to the paper capture, which actually drives a lot of cost. And then you kind of get into what, say, the straight through processing. We call it day one processing. That's like less than 5 cents per check. It's almost negligible, the actual cost of straight through processing. So it's about 5 cents per check, but out of a total of 20 to 40 cents per check if you take it all in. So most of the cost of check operations is around exception processing, paper handling, all the non-straight through processing things. So one thing we've done very well as an industry is we've made the straight through piece very, very efficient. The exceptions now are somewhat rare, but they're very expensive, mostly because the infrastructure built up around those exceptions was built for an earlier time when it made more sense to have that. So if you look at it, the straight through piece is very cheap. Almost none of the cost is being passed on to the consumer, right? So if we come back to sort of blend together a few of the questions that you've asked, the reality is, as an industry, we've made it very easy for people to continue to use checks. And I think the point that was made, there's probably a false belief that checks are more secure than they really are. But the flip side of that is most of the risk lies with the FI, not with the end client.
But just to go back.
Yeah, and if I took this in a slightly different direction, I couldn't agree with what Greg says more. But one of the things I always heard, back in the day of TCP, back when everybody, had to be a 30-year check expert, and the answer was, well, that's just check. Check is special. Check is something different than the rest of what payments were everywhere else. And I think we spent the last 8 years, after that point, proving that actually isn't the case. There are anomalies with check which are different. There are handling experiences with check that are different. But the fact is, a payment is payment is a payment. And the modernization that the banks have been investing into to drive check towards the rest will help in the process of modernization across the platform. That said, there's lingering usage and use cases that really do drive check well. So back to the idea of how do we drive check out of the industry? Well, first we had to make it not such a special and unique thing. So that, I think, to a great degree has happened. The next step is we've got more to replace because the experience of a check cannot be replaced yet. So we're getting there.
So talk to us about this, Andrew. Talk to us about the future of payments. There's obviously modernization ongoing. What are the trends? Where are things going in this check part of it? And to talk to us a little bit about that.
Sorry, I didn't know if Jude wanted to add a last point.
It's maybe it's a good segue into this one. Just to build on the cost piece. So yes, remote deposit capture was a huge win for the industry. Brought cost down, brought variable cost down considerably. So what you're largely left with in the check world, unlike the cash world, for example, are much more heavy fixed costs. Now the fixed costs in the check world, those clearing systems are largely depreciated. So that's not the fixed costs that you're worried about. The fixed costs are this ongoing needed investment in fraud, the connectivity to those other systems, other payment mechanisms in and around fraud, and then just the upkeep. So keeping them on the right modern technology stacks, avoiding rust out, keeping them current from an architecture and perspective, that becomes the challenge in check. So industry's done a great job at ratcheting down the variable cost of check. This ongoing fixed cost, actually speaks then to, how does the industry move forward and address that in an elegant way, because it's still out there for as long as that billion checks continues to drop.
Yeah, and I'll add to what Jude's saying. I think the big spend in the the straight through processing, everything that got sort of bolted onto the back of the capture, which enabled the electronic exchange, et cetera. That's largely paid for. A lot of banks, I would say most banks, are looking at significant investments to keep that stuff up to date and prevent the rust out, because they're all sort of at that age now where they're 5+ years where they need some significant maintenance. But the other piece is the fixed cost of the paper, the exception processing, the physical plant, everything that was sort of built for a day when paper ruled when it came to check, and getting rid of that investment, I think, is sort of job one that banks need to look at. And then the second piece is the basic core infrastructure required for check exchange is essentially the same. To Andrew's point about check is different, the corollary to that is everybody's check is different. Well, the reality is they're not as different as people would assume, and they don't necessarily need to be as different, especially as volumes come down. So one of the things that we're pushing really hard for from a payment center perspective at IBM is creating a utility or creating utilities around check, the ability for ways to spread the cost across FIs, as opposed to everybody maintaining that sort of rust-free infrastructure on an ongoing basis. When the end date, the last check, is almost unknowable at this point. There's so many factors that go into it, not least of which the interaction with the United States as our largest trading partner. It's hard to say, will it be 5 years, 7 years, 10 years from now? It's not going to be 2 or 3 years. I think that's pretty clear that it's not going to go away in 2 or 3 years. So there's a significant amount of money required to continue to maintain that ability to process checks.
So that's it. So that's all the investment that has been made with the remote capture. In the past, let's say in the past 20 years, all the investment that's been made in checks, and that's been in the billions of dollars across the industry. How can banks recover or maybe figure out a way to de-invest or leverage the investment that they've made into something else? What's the strategy there?
I like your term.
Maybe I'll start with that.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I just going to pick up on that term, de-investment. I think that is the right strategy on check. So no one's arguing that you need to put more money into it. It's how do you scale back that ongoing fixed cost of check, knowing that your volumes are going to decline. Accelerated because of COVID, accelerated because of Payment Canada capabilities, accelerated because of pay tech and fintech offers that start to surround and get out to market. So it is largely a strategy, Abdulah, of de-investment, and I don't think a firm can do it on its own. This is where industry ecosystems, partnerships, figure out who can be consolidators in the tech world, in the infrastructure world, and partners to help give easy off ramps to those ongoing carrying costs of the check infrastructure are going to be important over the next 5 years.
Yeah, and I'll add to that we're talking about check here, but the fact of the matter is, after real time hits, look at EDI, look at ACH, look at AFT, look at everything else, and start saying the same thing. The fact of the matter is, you investing into these silos or even investing into modernization of plumbing, which is what this is, doesn't make sense. You have to have a strategy of looking at it and saying, listen, these are commoditized capabilities. How do I address them a different way? What's my new business model so that I can actually future-proof my investment? And the investment should be focused on your customers, not on the plumbing.
So again, and I'm looking at this, and I want to talk a little bit about modernization. I mean, we know what's coming in the next year, especially with RTR. Why are we still looking to invest in checks? Like, why do we still need to invest in checks? Should we not look at this as, we're trying to innovate, and this is just slowing us down because we need to make sure that whoever is still doing checks is still, is taken care of. Is this not slowing us down? Are we not just carrying a huge bond chain with us, a huge weight with us that's slowing the innovation? Should you not be focusing on making sure to recreate the flexibility of checks using real time or using EFT? That's really my point of view there. I see an issue there.
I'll give you my opinion, and then welcome Andrew and Jude to add. I don't think the investment in check or the keeping check going is preventing investment in alternatives. I think looking at it a slightly different lens, it sort of sets the bar in terms of convenience and flexibility, right? And it does present a challenge because we've spent money making it even more convenient for people to do. So getting people to move is typically based on two things. People will move because it's cheaper or because it's more convenient and easier. Well, the reality is checks are essentially free. So we're not going to be able to make it any cheaper unless we find a way to start spreading that cost out to customers. And that's never been successful in the past. So I doubt that's going to happen. It has to be something that's going to be as or more convenient. That's really going to make it. And do we continue to invest in check? Obviously, you need to reduce the investment. I think that's the right strategy. But you can't lose sight of the fact that $3 trillion a year in the Canadian economy goes through checks. You can't not process them. You can't create giant holes in your infrastructure that create risk for the FI or for your customers. You still have to provide the service in spite of the fact that it's essentially free.
Yeah, and to add to that, I don't think it's an investment in check that matters right now. Just like I wouldn't,
Right.
put a lot into investing in AFT either. I think it's an investment in, architectures that provide agility to your enterprise. And what I mean by that is when you address the check issue, and the fact that it's not such a silo, you should be addressing the fact that all your payments need to move out of the legacy systems they are in and into much more flexible, resilient, and future-proof architecture. So then you ask yourself, how do you achieve that? And if you achieve it for check, you probably have already achieved it for AFT, and you've probably positioned yourself to do blockchain, and you've probably done many other things. Check is just a catalyst in this case. But to Greg's point, you can't get rid of it, or at least you can't get rid of it unless you mandate getting rid of it. So address it and make it part of your decisions going forward.
Do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, Abdulah, I don't think any of us are advocating any continued investment in check. It's really this off-ramp strategy. And how do you invest in an elegant off-ramp strategy? You can't, I don't think policy can be the first thing, right? Because it's, a small country that can simply say, hey, we got enough out there in alternate payments that will just outlaw checks, right? They can do that. We can't do that with that $1 trillion of value going through there. So while you'd like governments and corporates to say, yeah, we're just going to stop using checks altogether, there's a huge movement that has to happen on two other bases before you get there. So before you can make the policy decision, you have to tackle the economics. And this tackling the economics is move the cost to variable, figure out how you get renewed scale out of consolidation, partner more, find out ways to make sure that your architecture is not just usable for checks going forward, but it's actually keeps you moving in all payments type, and avoiding getting stalled in the future. And then last but not least is create the alternative. So how do you make something as ubiquitous, as high scale, as standardized, inspiring the trust, convenience, confidence, give it at the same cost that corporates and consumers have been paying to date, and give you all the flexibility that you can embed it into your digital transactions in the future. So if you do that, create value, and you tackle the economics by changing business models around it, then you can make the call on the policy side and say, great, that means in 5 years, there's no more checks.
So, okay, I hear you. And there's probably a couple steps, and I agree. There's a couple steps before we get to a policy or a mandate that stops it. But I'm, and Greg mentioned it a few times, the checks are almost free. So where is this revenue stream coming from? Why are the banks not pushing to get checks out? Is there really a huge revenue stream coming in if nobody's paying them? And I'm looking at this, is there a conspiracy to keep checks around?
Yeah, I don't know that anybody's got a revenue stream that's directly associated with check. It's clearly tied in with the other products, especially business banking products, and it's maybe not a loss leader. It's more like a cost of entry, right? You have to provide it. it's certainly not it's certainly not something that's driving the revenue side of the house. But it's an interesting thought, right? Like from a bank perspective, what's in it for them? I mean, what's in it for you is that the typical top 5 Canadian bank is clearing something like $1 billion+ of checks a day. So there's money flowing through your institution. If you somehow could even bring your head around saying, I'm not going to support checks, which you wouldn't be allowed to do, but let's just say you could in a theoretical world, you're basically cutting yourself off from that $1 billion of a day flowing through your institution. So hopefully banks are clever enough to figure out how to make money off that $1 billion a day, because they're not making any money off the check.
But that's if an individual bank would decide unilaterally to stop supporting it. If it's a government-led mandate to stop checks across the board, you're not changing anything. Every institution will have to stop.
I mean, my personal feeling is that the biggest single backstop to that happening anytime in the near future is the fact that there's still so much cross-border trade, and the ability for us to accept cash and write US dollar checks to US dollar customers, suppliers, etc., is critical to the Canadian economy, right? I mean, we can't ignore the fact that we have the largest trading partnership in the world is with a country that loves checks even more than we do.
Yeah. And I also think that this is a country where, salmon safety is very important. It's not necessarily like south of the border where it's speed. But here's the thing. Every time a country tries to mandate something, it doesn't always end the way you expect. And you have so many that are unserved. So you can go that way, but that's not typically the way we went, right? And the way we typically go as Canadians. So for this industry, I don't believe it's the answer. For our friends south of the border, that's just not the answer. So I think to Greg's point, North America is going to have a little bit of check for a while.
See, I like the glass half full part of the answer too here. I think the opportunity for new modern digital payments to start driving the value that used to be associated only with check is going to be our answer. Getting consumers, businesses excited about those alternatives as they're invented through links and RTR and ISO standards and stuff, should pave a way for innovation in this space, so that checks aren't a millstone from a cost perspective. They actually can be the driver of innovation as you invent new replacement business models around it, right? Because you've got that volume of transactions and that volume of value in your hands as a set of FIs. Convert that gracefully into the models that will actually keep your bank strong and government strong, and don't cut off your nose to spite your face by doing it too early without a replacement plan that the industry is willing to build scale around.
Exactly. You might even say that if you mandate things, you kill innovation. And the reason for it, back to Jude's point, is because it's a target, because it's a catalyst, because it's there, you have a number of companies looking at alternatives on different industries, on how to serve those industries to meet that demand, meet that use case. If you get rid of it and you mandate it, then it disappears. It's not a focal. It's not a sore point to address. It's not a pain point. Because it's a pain point today, and nobody truly wants to invest into it of itself, it is now a point of innovation. And that's what innovation needs. You need to know what you're innovating against.
And I like one of the comments that we're getting is, who's looking into the reason why checks are still issued today? And when we're looking at innovation modernization, the whole modernization program is ongoing. Are we looking as part of this modernization to, on checks and who's still issuing and identifying those use cases, because there might not be that many, to say, well, we need to figure out a way to cover these use cases? Are we talking mostly, cross-border? Is this something that we need to figure out a real-time integration between RTR and TCH or Interact e-transfer and Zelle or whatever, some kind of combination there to get rid of those specific use cases?
I think it's going to be a bit of all of the above, right? This is the place where innovation will scramble. Will it come from fintechs and paytechs in partnerships with the banks, or on their own? Will it come from the e-commerce retailers or B2B commerce suppliers in that space, right? Or will it be the banks themselves, and what roles will the bank play in it? So I think that's the battleground sitting there over the next 5 years. Who claims the best ground to actually grab, the best fulfillment of that use case in the future, Abdulah, is a little bit up in the air. And if you're not thinking about it in exactly the way you described, you're going to be left out, right? You're just basically sitting back and saying, let's see who takes it.
So what place does check have in the modernization program? Where does check land once RTR is ready next year? Where does that land?
And we did have a chat. We started with Payments Canada about a year ago. Past 22, 23. What can we do with the in Canada if the volume of checks drops significantly, such that it's you want to start shutting off a clearing system, but hasn't disappeared because of the stickiness of some of the use cases. So one thought there is expanding the RTR architecture in the future, such that you could take the information associated with the check image and clear it on the real-time rail, as opposed to old clearing systems. That helps systematically dismantle some of those old clearing systems. Now, I think we have to get through links in RTR and build the right use cases around that first. But it's one strategy that could start combining future architecture of payments with getting rid of some legacy.
So it's really
and I think that's, if we think about it, I think that's got to be part of the equation, right? I mean, if we take the last sort of two questions you asked, Abdulah, one is, what are the reasons why? Every time we talk about the reasons why, we're sort of getting smaller and smaller subsets of use cases. But as long as they exist, you have to have the capability of clearing it. And you go, okay, well, at what point do I not want to spend millions of dollars to clear, 500 checks or a couple thousand checks or whatever, right? So the question is, how do I take that check volume and start processing it through the clearing system that I know has longevity to it? And I do think that's ultimately where we end up, because it's going to get to the point where you've still got some of those use cases, maybe cross-border, maybe very specific B2B use cases, where you go, there's no real easy practical alternative yet, but I don't want to be spending all that fixed infrastructure just to cache it. So I want to build it on top of something that has some legs. And at some point you can shut it off. There comes a point where you say, you've got a very viable alternative for that use case, so I'm going to shut it down. And if we think about kind of where we've come with checks so far, we haven't completely got rid of individuals writing checks to other individuals, but almost. There's that is not a significant use case, and it's a relatively easy use case to get rid of, right? So I think that's ultimately where we're going to go. We're going to sort of play whack-a-mole with all the various use cases, and we're going to find a way to basically funnel the checks through the clearing systems and back office systems that are being built for real-time rail.
I think that the other benefit of that is that you're leveraging your investment in fraud and payments connectivity and AML, right? So that you're not trying to figure out how do you keep investing that on a singular old check system. It leverages all your new investment that you're building around modern payments.
Yeah, let me take a shot, and Andrew, if you could add some color to it. But our basic strategy around check is to create an industry utility, and we're not doing it on our own. We're partnering with software providers, business operations providers, et cetera. And we're building it as part of our payments utilities, with the idea being that we give you the ability, or we give FIs the ability to create scale that they can't create on their own. Scale that was unnecessary 2-3 years ago may not even be necessary just yet, but is going to be necessary, say, 2, 3, 4 years from now. So the first key is making sure that we can create a utility that shares the costs across multiple FIs. And we're acting as sort of pulling the utility together. We are the single throat to choke, but we're not doing it alone. We're pulling in best of breed providers from a software perspective, from a services perspective, to be able to give that, to be able to provide that. But also because not everybody has the same challenge. Not everybody's at the same degree of dealing with the rust in my systems. we sort of parcel it out. We've created the components of checks. So, I've got a problem with day one processing or fraud or day two processing or capture. You can grab those pieces, do that as a utility and bolt it into your system. So part of it, and we talk a lot about architectures, it's making sure you have a flexible architecture, and maybe piece by piece, you're moving more to a utility model when it makes business sense to do it. And by providing that, not only are we giving ourselves a business model that blends nicely into payments as a service over time, it really provides the industry something that's lacking right now, which is that ability to provide scale as the volumes drop.
Yeah, I think if I was going to add one thing, it's what Jude said. It's around sharing. If you think about it from an economies of scale perspective, is it really that different for me to handle an ACH than an AFT? Is it really that different for me to handle, wires or every other type of payment? When you think about the tools, the business rules, the workflows, all of the things necessary to make a vibrant architecture, I'm going to tell you, to a great degree, that cost is something I can share worldwide. Security is an example. I pay for, security for Canada. I pay for it for the world. The fact is I should be able to leverage these things worldwide. And in the world we just inherited over the last year, it's probably a good idea that I should be able to manage my payments infrastructure and operations from anywhere in the world at any time by anyone, right? And that's kind of what our vision is. That's what we're trying to drive to.
So there's a couple things. Absolutely, our focus and sort of the main driver was looking at the challenges that FIs face, but absolutely that's true for corporates and governments as well. So they look at a different piece or different components, call it, within the check as a service offering. So absolutely, our offering, and we specifically designed it this way, is broken into basically 6 high-level components around capture, day one, day two, fraud, archive. And a corporate probably cares more about things like capture and archive and some other pieces. They don't care as much about the back office processing. So those pieces are available to corporates and to governments as well as to FIs.
Yeah, and if I was to add one thing, we're creating more like an ecosystem where if you're a fintech, you can leverage what's in this, in what we provide and the utility, and provide a business unto itself. Actually go out to the market and white label it. If you're a corporate, you can consume services or you can actually create your own. If you're a bank or even a credit union, you can create your own services and provide them to everyone else in the ecosystem. So think of it as developing a marketplace more so than just, payment rails and payment infrastructure, right? Just making sure that there is going to be innovation out of this, but it's probably not a bad idea to leverage everybody else's innovation at the same time.
An interesting thought.
Probably a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Jude.
Yeah. I was going to say probably a question for Payments Canada, but I'm sure IBM would want to leverage it because so much of your other payments modernization, utility investments start building capabilities that could take advantage of it if you could just shift the volumes of checks to these rails.
Exactly. I mean, one of the reasons why we believe it's critical to have that type of utility capability is if we build it for one client, it becomes leverageable for multiple clients. So real-time rail falls squarely into that category, which is if we can find a way to make checks sort of merge or on-ramp onto real-time rail, that becomes a capability that we could move all of our clients there in sort of one fell swoop.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, we're getting one interesting question from the audience today, and from Claude. People are so concerned with the confidentiality of personal information, and they
I see a question here that says, if I'll paraphrase, all the other payments methods cost me money and checks are free. So why should I move? And this is really the challenge, right? I mean, at the end of the day, people, businesses, we're all pretty simple. At the end of the day, we move because it's cheaper or because it's more convenient. So at the end of the day, what's going to happen, short of an edict that shuts down check, what's going to cause consumers and businesses alike to move is a more convenient approach. The reason consumers moved off of check is because the ability to do email transfers, e-transfers, Interac e-transfers, became so simple that it actually became more convenient than finding my checkbook. We need a similar analog with businesses to get them off of check. It's not going to be a cost equation in all likelihood, because I don't believe that anybody is going to have the chutzpah or success in starting to charge businesses a significant amount of money for checks. I don't think that's going to happen.
I'll end on one point though. I actually don't know where my checkbook is, so I think that actually is the key to getting rid of check.
Get rid of the checkbook. Any other questions from the audience? I think we lost our moderator. At least I don't see Abdulah anymore. So something must have happened to his internet connection. Any other questions from the audience for any of us on the panel?
I was hearing Abdulah in the background over there. So I think one question he was trying to get out was, there's a bunch of information that flows with checks. Should we be concerned about, privacy and security around that? But with ISO 20022, I think there's going to be more information that is going to be better defined and controlled in the future than what's flowing through check. So I think it will mature the information flow that's around check to, many more fields, hopefully industry defined standard fields, and better information protection regimes around it than what are flowing through our check clearing systems today. I'm sorry, I only got half the question from Abdulah coming partway through.
Can you hear me, Greg?
That's what was coming out of the audience, Greg.
Somebody asked if, did you say that Canada still processes $3 trillion per year in checks? That I think is, I'm rounding, I think it's about 2.85 trillion or something in the last full year of data. It's probably dropped significantly during COVID. It'll be interesting to see how much it bumps up. The general, if you go back 5 years, again, pre-COVID, we were at about a 6 to 7% drop in check volume, but the drop in check dollars was almost negligible. In other words, the price or the face amount per check was growing at almost exactly the rate that the drop in volume was occurring. So another question here, can you address copay check payments, especially in insurance sector claims? I heard you mention, Jude, that you've worked in the insurance sector, so I'm going to turn that one to you.
Yeah, I think, let me back it out a bit. So this is the notion of bulk payments or split payments having to come out of insurance as corporates, right? And what are the mechanisms that can make it easier for check to do so? When this had, the most recent use cases around this, correct me if I'm wrong, would be the need to get those government programs through COVID out. And I would think that, investment in copay payments, in making them more elegant and should be in the digital world. I wouldn't do this I wouldn't think anybody's advocating to do this in the check world. Do what the government did and actually figure out new digital payments mechanisms that deal with this. Does that kind of make sense if I'm getting the question? This should be a payments modernization rather than an RTI question.
I wonder if the question here is related to having a check that's potentially intended for multiple parties, or is that maybe where it's going? I don't know.
Yeah, well, or even if it's for one party and you're tracking the copay, the insurance component of it for being paid. Either way, you're better addressed. Those should be addressed through data-rich payment mechanisms with traceability that both parties have, met their obligation to whoever they're paying.
Yeah, and I'll say just as a general case, I mean, there's a very specific use case, but again, I think what it drives is checks. Over the last 500 years, we've made checks incredibly flexible. You can do a lot with a check. And the real challenge for the industry is to create alternatives that are just as flexible.
I think we're, unless other questions come in, we're probably wrapping up. Greg and Andrew, I thought the discussion with you around this notion of, it's not an area for investment for investment's sake, of investment for investment's sake, because we all acknowledge that it needs to be replaced. We also acknowledge that business model innovation is likely to come out of a movement out of check as opposed to anything else, and then the adoption is a question that's out there really for all the RTR links and other types of modern payments that come out. How do you make it as simple and easy and embedded to use as checks have been for a few hundred years? So it's good covering those topics with you guys.
Yeah, thank you, Jude. Ditto. I really enjoyed the conversation. Hopefully, folks watching have enjoyed it as well. Okay, I think we're at time now, so we're going to wrap this session, and like to thank on behalf of the panelists and Abdulah, who's having challenges with his video audio. I want to thank everyone who joined the session. I really appreciate it.